Without further delay, I would like to invite our speaker to give today's talk. Dr. Kay Tan, the Architecture of Malaysia Mission School, Memory, Identity, and Heritage. I pass my mic.
Thanks very much, Dr. Goh and Intan and Mariana. I'll share my screen now and start. Okay, firstly, a very good morning to everyone, and thanks for coming to this talk and listening to me chat. As introduced kindly by ICOMOS, the talk for today is the architecture of Malaysia's mission schools, memory, identity, and heritage. Now, this topic is very close to my heart because not only did I come from a mission school, so did my wife. And there's a lot of both interest and misunderstanding about mission schools in Malaysia, starting with even what do we define as mission schools. A lot of people asking questions like, oh, is VI a mission school? Is Penang Free School a mission school? The way we define mission schools depends on actually our point of view. The way I define a mission school is that a mission school is a school that was owned or is owned by a mission institute. And the clearest and cleanest way to define that is mission institutes whose preamble, whose vision, mission, and charter is about providing education for people using a certain ethos. The two largest groups that started mission schools in Malaysia was the Infant Jesus Sisters and the La Salle Brothers, the crest you see on the left and right of your screen. The black and white crest is the Infant Jesus Sisters, the colored crest is the La Salle Brothers. And I will go through examples of their schools, their ethos, and their history throughout this talk. And as mentioned by ICOMOS, should you have questions, please feel free to post it in the chat group, and we will be answering them either at the end of the talk or during, depending on what the panelists tell me to do. So let me begin by talking about what do we talk or what do we mean when we speak of heritage. So my premise was that mission schools have a diverse amount of heritage. And there's also multiple concepts of identity leading to that plurality in heritage. And why do I say that? When you have a plural country like Malaysia, many ethnic groups, many religions, you will have many points of view about the same thing. So here in the mission schools, the interesting thing about the Christian mission schools is that throughout their history, the large majority of their students were non-Christian all the time. They never had majority Christian populations, even in the 19th century. At the same time, the administrators of the schools traditionally were Christians, Catholics in the case of the ICOMOS convents and the La Salle Brothers schools. And the heads were always members of these religious institutes until recently. And that came about and created this idea of a plural heritage because all the different groups of people attending these schools brought out and gained different memories from the schools. They created or enriched their self-identity from their schools and so on and so forth. But because my talk is mostly about architecture, I will be alluding to how that identity affects the architecture and how the architecture reflects the identity. Okay? This first image is showing two of the oldest schools. The one on the left, St. Xavier's Institution, Penang. The one on the right, St. Joseph's in Singapore. Now, I will allude to Singapore very briefly at the start and at the end of the talk, because for the purposes of mission schools, Singapore and Malaysia are one and the same, because the groups of people who started schools in both countries, same groups of people. Architects, same groups of architects in some instances. So here you have the two earlier schools, which were both founded in 1852, which is important for school purposes, less important for architecture, because with any building or campus that is living, you have a series of buildings that are constructed, demolished, enlarged, and so on and so forth. So in neither case do their founders' day building exist to today, and in neither case do the buildings that you see physically now in St. Xavier's and St. Joseph's date from 1852. They date a little bit later. The murals you see are taken from the KTM railway station in Tanjong Pagar, Singapore, the former KTM railway station. And the murals I always find are very interesting because they reflect the identity of what we shall call Malaya at the time. So the one on the left reflects the idea of the native peoples of Malaya. The one in the middle reflects the idea of the Asian immigration into Malaya. And the one on the right reflects the idea of European industry into Malaya. And all these groups of people have that contribution towards mission schools. And without any of these groups, the identity and the heritage of what we call mission schools today would be different, missing, weaker, less deep, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is we all have a place to play. We all have a role to play in the story of the mission schools. In order to start the talk, let me also describe the timeline of the mission schools in Peninsular Malaysia. Now, the talk will be principally all about West Malaysia, Peninsular Malaysia, with my apologies to any of our friends from Borneo who may be into this talk. And the reason is that the Borneo missions, and there are Borneo missions, were mostly run by a group called the Mill Hill Fathers. And the Mill Hill Fathers have a completely different origin and ethos compared to the Catholic missions in West Malaysia and Singapore. So for the purposes of my talk, I will concentrate on West Malaysia, but I'll be happy to take questions about East Malaysia as well. So as alluded to by ICOMOS at the start, when we start talking about mission schools, we have to allude back to the Portuguese mission of the 16th century, starting in 1548. So there was mission via conquest, and this was one school. So that one school in Malacca was one of the earliest formal schools in Southeast Asia, and the history of which is very slight, and I'll explain why in the next slide. In the major phase is 1852 to 1956, what I call the expansionary phase, where you had missionary activity in cooperation with the British colonial administration, where there was a grand total of 113 schools. These are totals, yeah? These are not additions, these are totals. Just alluding also to ICOMOS's introduction, and when we talk about the number of schools, you'll see different sources with different numbers of schools, be it heritage schools or mission schools. And the reason for the differences in numbers is it depends on what you define as a school. Do you define a primary school and a secondary school with the same name as one school? Do you define a primary school with Sekolah Satu, Sekolah Dua as two schools or as one school, etc., etc. So for the purposes of the original ethos of the mission schools, almost all your schools had a primary and secondary school connected to each other. So you've got St. John's Institution Primary, St. John's Institution Secondary, St. George's Institution Primary, St. George's Institution Secondary. For the purposes of the missionaries, it was one school. For the purposes of the Ministry of Education, it's two schools. So the different sources you see will give you different numbers because of the way they define schools. 1957 to 1989, you've got the independent phase, mission schools controlled by the Guild of Assisted Catholic Schools. So this was a guild that existed until 1989, which controlled the identity of the Catholic schools. Although they were by that time funded by the Ministry of Education, they were nominally independent in terms of how they were administered. This Guild of Assisted Catholic Schools was shut in 1989. And from 1990 to the present day, effectively you have a nationalized phase of mission schools, fully controlled by the Ministry of Education, although owned by the Mission Institutes. So the land and the buildings in almost every case is still owned by the Catholic Mission Institutes, although the administration and most of the funding is controlled by the Ministry of Education. So let's start at the beginning. This is the Citadel of Malacca, which housed what was called the College of St. Paul. Now, this is a not very well-known story. The College of St. Paul was a Jesuit group, those of you who might be Catholics will know that Jesuit priests are religious institute of priests, the largest institute in the Catholic Church, and they have existed since the Middle Ages. And during the time of the Portuguese occupation of Malacca, they had founded a chapel on St. Paul's Hill, the chapel that still exists today, the ruins of St. Paul's. And they had what was called the College of St. Paul. But that's not a college in the sense of the way we use college today. The medieval term college basically meant a group of religious people living together. So hence, the people who elect the Pope, the Catholic Pope today, is still called the College of Cardinals. They don't give diplomas, but a group of cardinals is referred to as the College of Cardinals. So the Jesuit priests who lived in Malacca on St. Paul's Hill were termed the people who formed the College of St. Paul. But the College of St. Paul ran a primary school, and that primary school served the population of Fortaleza de Malacca, the Citadel of Malacca. There are many historical drawings of Malacca, some of which are not accurate, meaning that the most well-known one, which I've not included here, is a very European-looking map of Malacca that was drawn by someone who had never been to Malacca and was drawn after the Portuguese had already lost Malacca for a book that was given to the Portuguese king. And I have not included that image because it's not actually historically accurate. This map on the left, although not the most attractive in the world, was drawn by someone who did visit Malacca and is said to be moderately accurate. So you've got a lot of planted farms within the walls of the citadel. You've got what was the Famosa down here, and you've got St. Paul's Chapel up here with the college and the primary school. Just a historical note, the Formosa that we speak of today does not refer to the citadel. The Formosa refers to the original fortress by Alfonso de Albuquerque when he captured Malacca. Historical laziness, I would say, has caused people to refer to the whole thing as Formosa, whereas actually it referred to the original fortress, which was originally in timber before it was expanded in stone. When the citadel was built, eventually the Portuguese referred to it as Fortaleza Velha, which means the old fortress, to differentiate it from the new fortress. Fast forward to the 20th century, this was a map drawn by the British in 1930s. And you see, of course, the citadel had long been demolished by William Farquhar in the 19th century. And here you have the wall of the citadel replaced by a road called Fort Terrace, currently called Jalan Kota, which roughly replicates the perimeter of what was then the Dutch wall, the strengthened Dutch wall. This is the Sea of Malacca. This is the Sea of Malacca on the Portuguese drawing. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a long history of mission schools in Malaysia. They start in the 16th century. And then there was a relationship between those mission schools and the urban center. By 1930s, there was another mission school, a new mission school in Malacca, and that was St. Francis Institution, which I'll allude to shortly. And that's over here. That's St. Francis Institution here. That's the Merdeka Museum, the current Merdeka Museum, which used to be the British Club in the Esplanade. All this land has been reclaimed. Now, the two crests here refer to the Crown of Portugal on the left, which founded the Citadel of Malacca. And the one on the right is the United East India Company, Dutch VOC, Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, which was the group that conquered Portuguese Malacca and demolished most of the Portuguese buildings. The only remnant survivor is St. Paul's Chapel, and almost everything else you see in Malacca is either Dutch or British from the colonial era. Now, why do I allude to Malacca when I start? And that's because that it's important to understand that almost all the mission schools are urban missions, not because they were specifically wanted to build schools in cities, but the opening of education encouraged people to move into places which eventually became cities. So here you've got Georgetown, Penang, and there are a few important things to mention in this map. This is taken from 1914. First, you see here on the left, RC College, Roman Catholic College, which I'll mention shortly. And then this little road with a church, and then you've got a road, another road, leading to Georgetown. And in Georgetown itself, you see Fort Cornwallis, the earliest British settlement. And you can just make out here St. Xavier's School, the La Salle School that I showed in the cover. And you can see here St. George's Girls' School. You can see here the convent, and you can see here Penang Free School. Currently, what's part of the Penang State Museum after Penang Free School was moved out. So you can see how schools tended to cluster together in Penang, and how mission schools especially clustered together, and how they were quite near churches. The St. George's Church is here, the Anglican St. George's Church, and the Catholic Assumption Church is also very, very nearby. So important were these spaces that also the mission institutes, which were becoming very large at the time, and I'll allude to the numbers later, divided their mission, their worldwide mission, into what were called districts. So the La Salle brothers, which ended up as the largest of the mission institutes, divided the East into what they call the District of the Indies. And eventually that District of the Indies, which was very, very large, was subdivided into several districts. And Malaysia came under the District of Penang. And it was called the District of Penang because that's where the earliest school was, St. Xavier's. And the District of Penang eventually grew to encompass Myanmar, Burma, Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia, and the southern part of what eventually became French Indochina, which eventually became renamed as the District of Saigon. So that's where we start. Now I'm going to stop going to use the word start because I'm obviously not in the start anymore. So I'm trying not to use the word start again. But architecturally, we begin with College General Penang. Now, College General Penang is the Roman Catholic college mentioned in this map in 1914. College General Penang was founded by a group called the Paris Foreign Mission, Mission Étrangère de Paris. And that's their logo here. So the Paris Foreign Mission still exists. It's a group of priests who basically, whose entire ethos is to found churches overseas, to found missions overseas. Now, although they didn't run schools in Malaysia, they were very, very important because they were the pathfinders for land for the La Salle brothers and the IJ Convent sisters for them to start schools. And architecturally, they did have a large presence in Malaysia as well, in this huge College General in Penang. It's currently Gurney Parrot Plaza Shopping Mall, if you want to know. After the College General this building was demolished in the 1980s, and the site was bought over and now occupied by Gurney Plaza Shopping Mall. I'll show you a photo after this. You can see the size of the site, that's 40 meters on the scale bar. So you can see it's well over 2 hectares in size, so it's a large site. The Paris Foreign Missions founded College General in the early 19th century when Penang was ruled by the British East India Company. And that's itself quite an interesting story, because at that time, bear in mind that Britain and France had just come out of the Napoleonic Wars. They were effectively enemies. They were fighting each other worldwide. So how is it that a bunch of French priests get invited to open a college in an island run by the British East India Company? So I think the history of the missions is a history of international cooperation, where even people at war with each other are friendly with each other in certain circumstances when it's talking about education, which I think is something that we should all remember going forward, that there's so much that unites us that it should go beyond what divides us. This is an image of College General campus prior to the Second World War. Now you can see the front facade here, and you can see the drop-off here, and that's the drop-off here from Kalaway Road, and that's the front facade on the map, on the plan, and that's it in the image. As I said, it's now occupied by Gurney Plaza. If you see these very, very large rain trees in the black and white photo at the back, some of these very large rain trees are still there in Gurney Plaza's forecourt. So if you go to the shopping mall in Gurney Plaza, for those of you who've been there, see those very big rain trees, they were originally the rain trees of College General in Penang. It was connected to Georgetown via a road called College Avenue, which is now called Lebuh Raya Maktab. Okay, same meaning, converted in Malay. There's a College Avenue, there's a College Lane. Okay, Lorong Maktab, Lebuh Raya Maktab. And here you see it, that is College Avenue, connecting the college to the main road that goes to Georgetown. So you can see that even in the naming of our streets, it reflects back to the importance of these mission buildings that existed at a certain time. And this Mission Institute, the College General, led us and was instrumental in getting land for the first of the major mission schools in Malaysia, St. Xavier's Institution. This is a figure ground, or rather a site plan or architectural site plan of St. Xavier's in 1896, when the campus existed in a certain fashion. And this is their prospectus dated 1877. So you see here, St. Francis Xavier's Institution, Penang, established in 1852. And then it's got terms for borders for day scholars, and it's probably too small for you to read, but I'll just mention here that they say $1 per month fees, okay, in 1877, $1 per month. Amongst the thing, they had a freedom to decide on their curriculum at the time, and amongst the subjects offered in 1877 were astronomy and French, apart from other things. So that tells you the academic beginnings of the Mission Institutes, a high degree of freedom, land bought for them or helped them by the French priests. Later on, additional land was in some cases donated by the sultans, in some cases set aside by the government when the role of the Mission Institutes became rather important in education. Sultans and the government started setting aside land for them to open additional schools. So here we have it, the earliest buildings of St. Xavier's Institution, two very fine pieces of architecture. The original one was completed by 1900. And this was the first building of the St. Xavier's. This same building was renovated by the LaSalle brothers to increase the size of their top story here, and eventually turned into this building by the 1930s. You can see the much higher roof of the second building compared to the first, and you can see the big mansard roofs on top of this second building. If you want to see a similar building, slightly similar in terms of the roofs in Southeast Asia, go to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and look at their town hall. It's got a similar type of roofing, okay, because you've got a very strong French influence in Saigon. Unfortunately, the second building was destroyed by American bombers in the Second World War. Now, I just wanted to allude to this to talk about the sensitivity or the fragility of our architecture, because this building was bombed right at the end of the Second World War by American bombers, whose primary base was actually the Japanese naval base in Singapore, the ex-British naval base. So after Japan had conquered Singapore, they used the British naval base, and these American bombers were sent to bomb that naval base. A few of them developed some technical engine problems and couldn't bomb the primary target. So they bombed their secondary target instead, which was this building, because it was occupied by the Japanese as well. So when we think of that terrible unfortunateness, meaning that destroying this building didn't change the course of the war, Japanese would still have lost. If the war had ended 2 months earlier, we would still have this building today, and history would be different. But we don't. So both buildings were destroyed, one by renovation and one by war. However, there's a very similar building that still exists. If you look at this building, St. Xavier's, 1930s, and you look at this building, St. John's, 1908, St. John's KL, you'll notice quite a similar design. Now, this building, St. John's Institution, again, let me just reiterate, the founding date of a school and when the buildings were built are not always the same. This building was built in 1908. This photo dates from that time. The school was founded in 1904 in timber. When this building was built, it was designed by La Salle brother, Vernier Auguste Clapp, French brother. He was in his late 20s when he designed this. So it talks about the idea of architecture being designed by people who are not necessarily formally trained in architecture, but they've got a strong vision, a drive to do it, and they don't have to be particularly old. On the right-hand side of this, you see the original St. John's Church, which is now the Catholic Church's Refugee Center. And St. John's Cathedral, which is not yet built in this photo, is behind this building. And on the left, you see a little chapel with residences for the La Salle brothers, which is in timber, which has now long disappeared. So from this 1908 building, St. John's, I will move forward to the same campus, same school building. This is from the rear, taken from their field, photographed in the 1930s. And why I wanted to show this building is to show that when you have buildings like this that were built so long ago, it housed very, very few pupils. So at the time they built this, they had about 100 students. Come one generation later, in the 1930s, they have about 500 students. And so they need larger quarters. They have more brothers. So this is now the La Salle brothers' quarters, replacing the timber building originally. A new chapel has been built inside the quarters, replacing the timber building as well. And you see a school hall, a single-story school hall that's built in extension. You see two styles developing now. You see the Romanesque of St. John's Institution. You see the Romanesque continuing on the school hall. You see an attempt to continue the Romanesque on the ground floor of the brothers' quarters, and you see something different on top. There's a school that's all now been lost, Bukit Bintang Girls' School. The Malaysians in the group will know this. And Bukit Bintang Girls' School had a slight similarity to the design of the brothers' quarters of St. John's on the upper levels. Fast forward one further generation, and you can see the same school, St. John's, painted white briefly by one of the brother directors. And you can see further extensions now in modern style. So we have the arts and science block starting to appear on the right and on the left. You can see the science block building on top of the Romanesque school hall. So this is one of the challenges facing a lot of the mission schools. As student numbers increase, how do you preserve the heritage architecture amidst the need to create modern facilities? And St. John's is a reasonable example of trying to do it reasonably well. And there are a lot of challenges associated with that, which I'll allude to in some of the later slides. Importantly to mention also with the Mission Institutes, the La Salle brothers and IJ sisters came to Malaysia at the same time. They both came in 1852. In 1852, they came by ship from Belgium, Antwerp, and there were about 10 of them, half brothers, half sisters, who came on the same ship. The leader of the nuns died on the way to Malaysia and was buried at sea. So you had their Reverend Mother, who passed away on board the ship, died and was buried at sea. As soon as they landed in Singapore, which was the port of call, the youngest of the nuns immediately left the institute, and she eventually got married to someone in Singapore and then became a teacher in the convent, but not as a nun. I always feel that that's probably a movie-worthy story. You've got 5 young men and 6 young girls, I think, who came as nuns, and one of them dies on ship, and as soon as you land, one of them leaves, etc., etc. Quite a good movie, and they all come by ship via the Cape of Good Hope, because the Suez Canal had not been built at the time. But because of that history, the La Salle brothers and the IJ sisters have this close relationship historically, and in many cases, their schools are built side by side. So this is Convent Bukit Nanas, photographed in 1912, and that's photographed across the street from St. John's. So can you imagine that when this school was built in 1908, 4 years later, just across the road, this school gets built. Now, unlike St. John's, which was designed by a La Salle brother, Convent Bukit Nanas is associated with JKR, the Public Works Department designed this convent. Doubtless with sketches from the nuns, but it is historically mentioned that two British architects working for the Public Works Department, Huxley and Kesteren, designed Convent Bukit Nanas. And at the time you design it, basically this pavilion came out first. This hall came out very, very marginally later. And the building was eventually extended on with one extra floor. If you want to see an example of this, very similar building without an extension, go to Klang Convent in Klang, and you'll see a very similar building. But after the extension, and roughly as it is today, this is Convent Bukit Nanas today. Same heritage block in the front. Instead of 2 stories high, you've now got 3 stories, much higher roof. You've got a very large chapel at the back. You've got 2 big halls. You've got lots of classrooms. So when you think about how the mission institutes expand, can they expand and still retain their architectural ethos? Convent Bukit Nanas is a very, very strong example of them managing to retain a very strong, cohesive sense of missionary architecture and yet expand the building to allude and to house more students. When you expand a mission school also, sometimes you create the desired effect of medieval architecture. Here you create 2 cloisters. So the cloister for the non-architects in the group is a traditional medieval design idea where if you have a group of monks, especially who live together, they are normally self-sufficient in food and they grow fruits and vegetables in a cloister. And the cloister is surrounded by a walk-in colonnade, which is overlooked by their residents and so on. And in the case of Convent Bukit Nanas, they managed to do that. And originally the nuns lived in this part of the building. They had their private cloister. The school had the second cloister. Some nuns still do live here. They run an orphanage. The cloisters are all given over to the school, however. And this is the satellite image of that relationship between the La Salle schools and the convent and the French mission churches. This is St. John's Cathedral here. This is the original St. John's Church. So both of these were founded by the Paris Foreign Missions. This is St. John's Institution, secondary school. This is St. John's Institution, primary school. This is Convent Bukit Nanas with further extensions beyond the screen. This is Bukit Nanas itself. This is the forest reserve. This is what used to be called Weld Road, now Jalan Raja Chulan. There used to be a Catholic graveyard on the site of the field of St. John's. So the Catholic Church directly through the Bishop's office owns part of the campus of St. John's, including some of the buildings to the rear here. When I went to this school, they had built an extension and the cathedral had donated the land for that extension. And they named the extension after the bishop at the time. I just wanted to mention the graveyard because that's why you always have these cheeky stories where everyone who goes to mission school will say, oh, it's haunted, it's haunted, it's haunted. Because, you know, in Malaysia, everyone likes a good ghost story. And the older the building, the higher the likelihood that something interesting happened there. And that's the history of St. John's. And you'll see that the gravestones from the graveyard have been removed long ago. But if you want to see 1 or 2, they actually do exist. Some of them are preserved. And you can see them in the bishop's, outside the bishop's office here. You'll see at least 1 gravestone, which I've personally seen myself. So I mentioned that because context is and was very, very important to all mission schools. Here you have St. Francis Institution, Malacca, 1908, to the design of Father Charles Benedict Nain. And I just wanted to mention that because you have schools which we have the record of the designer. And in the case of the La Salle schools, you had 2 particularly important people. You had this brother Vernier Auguste Clark, which I've mentioned before, who designed St. John's and several others, which I'll show you shortly. And you had this French priest, Charles Benedict Nain, who designed buildings in Malaysia and in Singapore, which I'll show you some more later. And you can see that evolution, not just of school design, you can see that evolution of their individual designs and how that's so important because many of these buildings are relatively well preserved today. And it's quite important to be able to appreciate that history. So this is SFI, St. Francis Institution, Malacca, 1908. And in front of it is the sea, the Straits of Malacca. A further out shot will show you that. That's the muddy beach of Malacca as it was at the time. This is the sea. And St. Francis Malacca expanded itself unusually by buying over a building owned by a rubber company. So in most cases, they demolish and built, demolish and built. Here they bought one. So they bought an existing building owned by a rubber company, and this eventually became where their brothers lived, and they had a big chapel extended behind the block. This building or this St. Francis is unusual because it still has at least one resident brother on site, which is not so common nowadays. Nearby in Malacca, again, you have an IJ convent school to complement the La Salle school. Now, the importance of the IJ convent schools really cannot be understated because at that time, there were almost no schools for girls in the whole of Malaysia. So the convent schools became the only schools if you really wanted a good English language education, especially for children, for females, regardless of your religion. So they became the go-to schools for anyone who wanted to do anything at the time if you were a girl. So this is the image of the convent school Malacca, 1970. And at the back, again, is the Straits of Malacca, the ocean. So you imagine how nice a context this is. How nice a context this is, where you have a sea-fronting school, right? You've got your school, your wonderful airy school with sea breezes at the back, and you can see the ocean at the rear. It's a really good context. And all that now is reclaimed. So you've got shop lots at the back, you've got a back lane, you've got, houses and etc. Sorry, jumping back, etc. And so, again, when we preserve mission architecture, sometimes, of course, we cannot preserve the site. The site context is beyond our control. The only thing we can look at are the buildings. But how do we then preserve the buildings if the site has changed? And I'll allude to that in the later images. So some schools are more fortunate than others. This is St. Michael's Institution in Ipoh, 1950s. Earliest portion of the design also by Vernier August Clark. Okay, so St. Michael's was extended twice in its original form. The original block, which is here, which was designed by Brother Vernier in the 1920s, which was then expanded to the left and the right, and then further expanded to the right back in the 1950s. So here we have a very impressive context in Ipoh. This is the main Ipoh field, Ipoh Padang municipal field, and you've got basically the town center to the south of the image, outside this photograph. You've got the Kinta River on the right-hand side. You've got the beautiful school field in front. You've got the Church of St. Michael, which is actually an Anglican church on the left. The Catholic Church of St. Michael is in the town center. You've also got a mosque in front of the school. So that's an interesting thing to mention, that comfortable relationship between mission schools and the non-Christian groups, like you've got a large mosque in front of a huge mission school. And that relationship, again, cannot be understated, that you had this very, very nice relationship at the time. You also had a comfortable relationship between the Catholic Church and the Protestant one. Same name, St. Michael's, St. Michael's. So here you have 1950s St. Michael's Institution. Here you've got 1964. They've just developed their own extension at the back. You can see how relatively sensitively it's done, where you can see the heritage architecture in the front. Very, very impressive. This was the longest continuous facade of any school building in Malaysia at the time. And you see this extension, the modern extension to the rear, invisible from the front. So if you come from the street, you don't see the modern extension. You only find it if you walk through the old building. But not all schools were that fortunate, okay? Because you have here St. Paul's Institution, Seremban, 1907, also designed by Charles Benedict Main. And here you see, depending on the point of view, a very impressive facade. This was alluded to as a Venetian design, Venice inspired. Very unusual in Seremban and so on. Now that's 1907. Let's fast forward to today. And this is the current occupant of the site, Wisma Punca Emas. So you got this shopping mall that was built on the same site after St. Paul's Institution was demolished in the 1980s. And this road was also called Paul Street. Okay, now Paul Street was not named after St. Paul. It was named after a British civil servant who happened to be called Paul. But most of the students who went to St. Paul's there was this urban legend that it was named after the school and it suited the ethos and everything. But here we have the replacement. So I will leave it to you, kind reviewers and panelists, to decide which one you think is a better occupant of the site. Would Seremban be better off with this shopping mall, or would it have been better off had they retained this rather delightful school? Same, let's still stick with Seremban. Sometimes you demolish a school and you don't replace it with anything. So here is the large convent in Seremban. Again, a very, very large building. You can see from the scaling bar that is again over 1 hectare in size, in front of what was called Birch Road, now Jalan Datuk Bandar Tunggal. This was an image of the campus taken in the early 90s, shortly before its demolition. And after it was demolished, that's its replacement. It's a very large lake. You may ask yourself, why would anyone demolish a large school and replace it with a body of water? Well, the intention was not to do that. The intention was to replace it with a large commercial building. But what happened was, when they cut the basement through the land, they hit a very high water table and the site flooded completely. Very, very unusual. At the site, the water is extremely clean, leading some people, again, these urban legends about the site being cursed, haunted, etc. You demolish my school, I flood your land, and so forth. The truth probably lies in the fact that many of the early mission schools had wells in them because they didn't have pipe water at the time. So they would choose land where they could dig a well. And so that means you've got a very high water table, which means if you cut the basement in, and they try to cut a 3-story basement in the land, you're probably going to hit this water table and it may flood. This, however, is very dramatic flooding, right? You can see this entire huge lake under what used to be this very large school. But what of the buildings that were not demolished, which fortunately are the majority, have not been demolished? Some of these are left slightly derelict. And the reason this happens is that when you have a mission school with no missionaries, part of the building was never zoned as a school. It was their private property, either their residence or their chapel. And that title is sometimes separate from the school itself. And when it's separate, it gets no funding at all, zero funding from the government for its maintenance. So here you have the chapel of Malacca Convent. This is my photo when I visited over 10 years ago now. At the time, they had this history of this hall. It had been converted to a hall, black. And it said here, 96-year-old hall was built as a very beautiful chapel in the Gothic style by Sister Macian in 1897. 2/3 its present size. Now, the reason was that it got expanded in the 1960s by Sister Pius. Now, oddly enough, I met Sister Pius in the UK. I used to work in the UK, and I've met her in the UK by coincidence before I wrote my books. Very, very delightful lady. And she used to be the headmistress of this convent. She expanded the chapel in 1960. But shortly after the expansion, the roof got attacked by termites, and when the number of nuns started to drop, etc., they eventually abandoned the chapel. That chapel was then given over to the PIBG, the PTA of the school, in 1990, converted to a hall, and so on. Now, subsequent to my taking this picture, it has been further renovated. It doesn't look as derelict as this now. It looks quite presentable, but the interior looks like this. It's a blank. The image on the left is a chapel in use at its height. You can see all these nuns at prayer in the front. You can see a decorated altar, and you can see stained glass at the end. This was my picture when I visited around 10 years back, again, as a blank. You can see the vaulted ceiling has collapsed because of the termite attack, not been replaced. You can see some steel structure which is new to hold up a new roof. The vaulted ceilings alluded to by these edgings. But at the floor of this, there is a memorial. You can see here, just about, sacred to the memory of Reverend Mother Sin Macian, superioress of the Convent of Malacca, who died on the 8th of December, 1899. All right. So basically, you've got a lot of history and heritage and memorials attached to these schools. They're there for people who bother to look, and they're there as long as they are preserved. You'll notice also that there are stained glass in the chapel image on the right, on the left, sorry. The black and white image has stained glass in it. On the right-hand side, you notice that the glass is blank, they're white, and you may wonder what happened. These are the stained glass panels. These are my photos. After the closure of the convent, what happens in Catholic chapels is that you either are consecrated or you're not consecrated. If you're not consecrated, it means that you cannot be used for religious services. This differentiates Catholic places of worship from Protestant places of worship. In many Protestant churches, Protestant friends will know that many Protestant churches in Malaysia especially are in shop houses. They are not what are termed consecrated ground. But traditionally, Catholic places of worship must be consecrated ground, consecrated places. And in a Catholic consecrated place, you will often have religious art. So when the chapel in Malacca was abandoned, the religious art was removed, including the stained glass. Now, in the case of the stained glass, it was removed and repositioned in the Catholic Cathedral in Johor Bahru. Now, unfortunately, there were 5 panes originally. 1 pane was damaged very badly during the transfer and basically was destroyed. So now you only have 4 panels left. They depict the journey of the Holy Family from Bethlehem to Egypt. Very, very beautiful images, and they can be found in the Catholic Cathedral in Johor Bahru. Fortunately, there are several chapels, several school chapels in Malaysia where the stained glass is intact and the chapels are functional. This is the chapel of St. Francis Institution in Malacca, also to the design of Brother Venya Orchestra. So this chapel survives by public subscription. Again, it doesn't get funding from the government. So they are, the old boys normally collect donations to upkeep this chapel, and they do that every year. They do that partially by selling a publication called Green and White, which is published by St. Francis Malacca and sold particularly in Malaysia and Singapore, but to some extent worldwide as well. And they have runs to collect money, etc., to upkeep places like this. So lovely design. This is taken from the upper choir and looking down towards the altar. And you can see here in the example of their stained glass, they've got this very elegant stained glass. This was also built in a La Salle Brothers Institute, the Ecole St. Luke School in Belgium, which is now also closed down. And this was an arts and crafts school that specialized in glassware, glasswork and metalwork. And you can just about make up the text here. It says here, "An obedient man shall speak of victory," from the book of Proverbs on the left. And on the right, "I adore in all things the will of God," on the right. And you can see on the images on the left, they allude to the mission of the brothers. You can see here a young man shaking hands with someone who is presumably his father. You can see a ship in the background. So this is the idea of a young man going on mission and never coming back. Something to remember also, prior to the First World War especially, if you went on mission, you never went back to your home country. You never saw your family again. You went permanently. This only changed, especially after 1965, where the ethos of the Catholic Church changed. Now, if you're missionary, you can go back, see your family, probably once a year, sometimes twice. But last time you did it, you never went back. And this alludes to that sense of mission. And this alludes to, this is, you know, the allegorical figures of Christ and his family and so on. And on the right-hand side, you see a brother taking his final vow and so on. So you can see how the story of the missions is told by the stained glass. Fortunately, we still have quite a number of relatively well-preserved buildings in Malaysia. This is the convent in Taiping on what used to be called Convent Road. So here's Sekolah Menengah Convent Taiping, and you can just make out here their motto in English: simple in virtue, steadfast in duty, right? So the original motto is simple dans la vertu, forte dans mon devoir in French, and then you've got the English translation. You also have the Malay translation on the current pages. This is St. Michael's Institution in Ipoh, contemporary view. So you can see the large size and majesty of the school. At the time, this is my photo. At the time I took this photo, a tall building was being built at the rear. The crane of the tall building is just visible. So if you visit Ipoh today, you'll see the skyline breached by that tall building. So the site context is changing for the mission schools because they are all mostly positioned in city centers. So how do we then preserve that ethos with the changing site context and so on? What do we concentrate on in terms of preservation? Question. For example, this building, in many of the buildings, they've had to replace the roof more than once. This is a metal roof of St. Michael's. Originally, it was, of course, a clay tile roof. And these changes or these huge renovations are not always funded by the government. It depends on the situation. This, for example, is the chapel of St. Michael's Institution, which was designed in 1941, or rather completed in 1941, just before the Second World War. This survives again by public subscription, like the one in Malacca. So it also had a termite infestation, but fortunately they managed to save the chapel without destroying the vaulted ceiling. And this is my photo taken from about 10 years back, quite good condition. This is its inspiration, the lower chapel of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris from the 13th century. So you can see how you can allude to the original. There is an ethos. You can see a slight similarity. Obviously, the Ipoh version is much more simple. This was, after all, below the King's Chapel in Paris. The higher chapel, the upper chapel of Sainte-Chapelle, is the better known one for tourism. That's where the kings of France used to worship. the people who worked in the palace worship down here. So this is the commoners' chapel. But you can see that volumetric relationship. And that's so important because these kind of designs, especially when associated with school buildings, are very rare in Southeast Asia. And this is an extremely strong example in St. Michael's. Not only do the mission schools preserve very rare designs, they also preserve very, very old buildings. So this is Convent Light Street, Penang, housing the government house of the East India Company, which is this yellow building behind this well. Now, this government house of the East India Company was the original headquarters of the government of Penang when the East India Company owned the island. It was also called Navy House at certain times. So before Penang became a crown colony, before Penang became a state, you had the East India Company running it as a fiefdom, and this was their headquarters. And now in relatively original form, that headquarters is part of Convent Light Street, Penang. Now this well was one of 2 or 3 wells dug by Francis Light when he arrived in Penang after 1786. So it's that old, these buildings. They come right to the foundations of Malaysia, really. And they allude to that interesting swashbuckling history of the country back in the 18th century and the 19th century. Now, similarly to some of these mission institutes, or what I will allude to shortly, is that Convent Light Street is being privatized. It stopped taking in students under the government system, and it's announced its own privatization and will start becoming some form of international school in the next few years. The full details are not out yet. So that's important to note because when you do that, now because Convent Light Street is in Georgetown, it's in the UNESCO core zone, it's a fully preserved and fully protected building. But what does that mean for the ethos of the mission school once it's privatized? Is it a good thing? Will the ethos be better preserved than under the government? Or is it a bad thing if you privatize and start charging people fees? So those are questions that challenge us when we look at mission school preservation. This is a photo taken of the Convent Light Street Chapel, 1933. And the other thing to mention also in terms of Catholic chapels is that many of them are very, very decorative before 1965. Now, after 1965, the Catholic Church had what was called the Vatican II reforms, which simplified the way Mass was conducted. Before 1965, Catholic services worldwide were conducted in Latin, for example, regardless of which country we're talking about. After 1965, they started being conducted in whatever the common language of the place was. So here you have what's called a communion rail. Before that, when you take communion, you Catholic communion, you come to the front, you kneel down, the priest gives you communion. The priest, by the way, faces the altar, he doesn't face the people, and so on and so forth. Very decorative. This is the Convent Light Street Chapel today, or 10 years ago, this is my photo. You will see the communion rail has disappeared, the decorative statues are disappeared, everything else is just about the same. Talking about the French connection, this is Joan of Arc, Saint Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, and her statue is here in the chapel. So you have the less decorative chapel preserved, but you have extremely decorative stained glass preserved in the chapel. So this is the stained glass of Convent Light Street, and you can see the medieval European character of the glass. And if you were not told that this is a school chapel in Malaysia, and you're told this is a medieval cathedral in Europe, depending on your point of view, it is an acceptable description because you've got this extremely European medieval appearance to it. There have been several examples of mission schools that have previously been privatized. This is St. Joseph's Novitiate in Pulau Tikus, Penang. Now, this was the main training center for the LaSalle brothers in their district of Penang. Now, as I mentioned, the district of Penang covered Burma, covered originally part of southern Vietnam, covered Thailand, covered Malaysia, and so on and so forth. And so they had a multinational teaching contingent and a multinational contingent of brothers who were trained here. It briefly also served as a government teacher training center for teachers who were only being trained to serve in LaSalle schools and mission schools, meaning that at the time there was a specific category for staff of mission schools, a category under the government where they had specific and slightly separate training. And this institute was licensed to do that. Now that license was not renewed in the 80s. And after that, there were not enough brothers to be trained purely as a novitiate. So this building became slightly surplus to requirements. And at the time it was privatized and leased out to Uplands International School. So this photo was taken at the time. It was run by Uplands. And let's fast forward again to today. This is the building today. It's been completely sold now. It's not privatized, it's sold now to Gurney Paragon, the shopping mall people in Penang, and rebranded as St. Joe's. So it's an event center now. There are restaurants and so on the ground floor. Now, just to mention when that privatization took place, in this building, you've got a little chapel here on the right. You've got some outbuildings here. You've got some outbuildings here. You've got an extension block here. Now, all those newer extensions were demolished, and only the original cruciform block, which you see here, the pretty part, as we'll call it, was preserved. And here you have it. There's a chapel on the top floor, a rather beautiful chapel, which is now an event space as well, but relatively well preserved. Context obviously completely changed. Just to mention, because this is Pulau Tikus, the sea is actually to the south of this photo. So again, imagine you're waking up in the morning, you're a trainee teacher, you walk into this hall, you walk past the tennis court, you can see the ocean. It's a beautiful setting. Currently, you walk out of the hall, you walk past down here, and you can still see the ocean from the shopping mall. Still a beautiful setting, it's just very commercial. So how does it affect what we have left? Now, this is the convent school in Tanah Rata, Cameron Highlands. I mentioned this school because it's built on leasehold land. Okay, so not all the mission schools are built on freehold land. You have some schools that are built on leasehold land. This is one of them. Built in the 1930s, 99-year lease, meaning that its lease will be expiring in the 2030s. Will the lease be renewed? Question mark. Do the nuns even want their lease to be renewed? Question mark. There have been many offers for this building to turn it into a hotel. Its site is magnificent. It's the high point of Tanah Rata. It looks down at Tanah Rata. This is its extended campus. You can see how large the building is. This building has a lot of history as well, because during Second World War, it was occupied by the Japanese. During the communist insurgency, it was occupied by the British Army and converted into their headquarters and hospital. So this was a military hospital for quite a while, headquarters of the army. And the school itself was moved to British Army barracks in Tanah Rata. So the nuns swapped their beautiful school with army barracks. The army commandeered the school until they left. And this building here, which is the school hall, was the first cinema in Cameron Highlands. So the British Army used this as a cinema. And at brief moments in time, public from Cameron Highlands was also invited to watch movies in this building, which is now the school hall and was originally designed as a school hall. But you can see from the first photo, this is the house where the nuns live. That's the campus. You can see the scale, size, and majesty of many of the mission schools and how imposing they are on their sites. So where does that leave us in terms of how we preserve, what we preserve, or what we do when we look at mission schools? Here we have, again, the Cameron Highlands Convent. This is the frontage. There is a Catholic chapel inside. It appeared in a recent local movie. Can't remember the name of the movie, but it was apparently very well received. It's a movie about a romance between a local woman and a Japanese person right after the Second World War in Cameron Highlands in Malaysia. And the school chapel is featured in the movie. For a long time, it was the only Catholic place of worship in Cameron Highlands. So regular folk would turn up here on Sundays to go to Mass as well. Recently, they've built a new church in Cameron, so this chapel is no longer used for that purpose. But the school is well preserved, but the question is what will happen to it in the future because it's on leasehold land. So do we do things like do magic drawings? These are two magic drawing sets. The first one is St. Michael's, Ipoh, by students of Taylor's University, my university. Second is UTM, who measured Cameron Highlands Convent. So you can see how much architectural interest there are in these buildings. And but do we just stop at just let's measure them and forget about them, or do we do something further? Question mark again. And to decide on that, we also have to decide, well, what is the role of the mission schools today? And maybe I started with some maps and I will end with a few maps as well. This is a poster from the convent sisters who are better known at the time as the Ladies of Saint Maur, in French, La Dame de Saint Maur, because their headquarters in France, in Paris, used to be on a place called Rue Saint Maur, Saint Maur Road. And so in the French-speaking world, especially, they were called La Dame de Saint Maur because they're Ladies of Saint Maur. When they started in Saint Maur Road, they were not actually a religious institute of nuns. They were just committed women. They were normal women. They only became a religious institute later. By the time they came to Malaysia, by and large, they were considered a religious institute of nuns. So this was their poster in 1934, and it shows their expansion. This is Penang, shows their school in Penang. I know the image is too small for you to make out the architecture, but that's Convent Light Street, Penang on the upper left. Then you've got the Taiping Convent here. Then you've got the Ipoh Convent here. This is Convent Bukit Nanas in KL. Then you've got the Seremban Convent here, the now demolished Seremban Convent. You've got the Malacca Convent here, and you've got their convent in Singapore, which was their mother house in the region. And this is an image of a nun at the time, fully hooded, robed, etc. in black. This uniform eventually became black and white, then eventually became white. Now they are not committed, or they do not have to wear robes if they don't want to. And then here they have some statistics and so on. So here they're talking about how many English language schools they have, how many Chinese language schools they have, how many Tamil language schools they have, how many orphanages they run, and so on. So the idea was that they ran schools, they ran orphanages, and so forth. That was their mission in Malaysia. They've left behind some very, very beautiful buildings, some very, very beautiful pieces of art. This is the chapel of the school in Ipoh when it was used. This was also deconsecrated a while back. Chapel is still there. It's now used for the music club of the school. Stained glass was cut out. These are the panels of the stained glass. These are my photos. And these are now in the IJ Convent retirement home. Well, it's their headquarters in Cheras in KL, but essentially it serves as a retirement home for many nuns. And this is now in their chapel. So similar to the LaSalle brothers panel, it shows the idea of a nun taking her inspiration. In this case, however, it's a historical figure. It's a nun who became a saint in the Catholic Church. So it's the idea of people receiving instruction and the idea of what they do after they receive instruction. And so that idea of mission, that idea of service and so on is all embedded into the art of the missions. So where does that leave us in terms of national heritage? So there's actually only one mission school in Malaysia fully listed at its maximum level of heritage protection, which is St. John's in KL, designed by Brother Venier. And this is his image, Brother Venier. There are similar buildings in Singapore, also listed as national heritage. And that's St. Joseph's Institution and the convent, the Victoria Street Convent. And those are in Singapore, you've got that highest level of national heritage. And these were designed by the same priest who designed the school in Malacca, for example. So you've got that idea of some priests whose work are preserved and we know who they are, and their work are preserved at the highest level of heritage. You've got some brothers, we know who they are, and their work is preserved to the highest level of heritage. The buildings in Singapore that are preserved no longer function as schools. So similarly to the one in Penang, the Victoria Street Convent Chapel in Singapore is an event space. You can rent it for dinners, weddings, that kind of thing. It's very popular for weddings, especially because of what it looks like. St. Joseph's Institution is now the Singapore Art Museum, so it no longer functions as a school. St. John's Institution KL is still functioning as a school. Part of it has been privatized for an international school. Most of it is still functioning as a Sekolah Kebangsaan, a national school. Okay? So that talks about that choice facing not just the religious institutes, it faces alumni, it faces interested parties and so on. How do we preserve and what do we preserve them as? This is my last slide before we open it up and for Q&A and things like that. It's to say thank you, not just for me thanking you for listening to me talk, but I think also for me to extend a thanks to the missionaries who came to Malaysia to give us education. This photo was taken from the LaSalle Brothers retreat in Ipoh in the 1950s. These are not all the brothers who lived in Malaysia at the time. Just to mention, at its peak, we had over 200 LaSalle brothers in Malaysia. We had nearly 600 IJ sisters in Malaysia. And at their peak, there were nearly 18,000 LaSalle brothers worldwide and nearly 2,000 IJ sisters worldwide. If I were to repeat the statistics now, we have approximately 20 LaSalle brothers in Malaysia. I think the number is just under 20 now. Less than 4,000 LaSalle brothers worldwide. We have just over 100 IJ sisters in Malaysia and just under, if I'm not mistaken, 200 IJ sisters worldwide. The numbers have collapsed. So, and of those numbers I just mentioned, most of them are in their 70s, yeah? So retirement age. So the idea that the missionaries are there to steward their schools is unfortunately unrealistic because there are very few of them, they're very old. So what does that leave us with if we have heritage without the stewards? How do we do that? What's that mean? And I think those are the questions that bug us or drive us going forward. Yeah. All right, so thank you very much for listening to me, and I will pass it back to Mariana to have Q&A if anyone wants to ask questions.
All right, to Goh actually. Goh, is your connection okay? Can you proceed to lead the Q&A?
Oh, yes. Okay.
Okay.
Now,
Right.
now it's way better. Okay. Dr. Kee, sorry, never answered any questions. So let make you talk for 1 hour non-stop.
No problem.
Okay. We have the first question coming in from Lim Chi In. He say, "Hi, Dr. Kee. Is it possible to maintain the architectural style of this heritage school event even when extension is needed for the increasing number of students in the modern era?"
Okay, thanks for the question. The answer is yes, but it's a bit difficult because what happens is in many cases of especially the older schools, they had open air corridors, arched corridors, naturally ventilated. And in some cases, they had corridors on both sides, meaning that you got a classroom in the middle, imagine a building plan, corridors on both sides. Now, the reason is, especially if you have orientation, which is east-west facing, and if the room got morning sun as well as evening sun, they would protect both sides of the classroom to make it as cool as possible. Because remember that in the earliest mission schools, there was no electricity, right? So they're literally using every possible passive design convention to keep the school building comfortable. Some of them, at the very minimum, have closed up one of these corridors because they've extended the size of the classroom. So they windowed up the corridor, or in some cases, bricked up the corridor, so that open arched situation disappears in some of the schools. And then you keep one corridor. So it depends on what's the major facade, what's the minor facade. So that's point number one. Point number two is quite often when you design a new block, even if you preserve the old block, you remove the sight lines of the classical block so that you can no longer view it from its impressive angle because you've got some modern thing in front of it or beside it, etc. So these are some of the challenges facing architects and architecture. But again, the question depends on what you think these schools are here for. If you think they're here to provide education, then in theory, we should not worry about architecture. If you think they're here to provide identity, then architecture is extremely important. Because unfortunately, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the ethos of the mission schools has disappeared. And if you were to go to a mission school today, in many cases, again, not all cases, it's so similar to going to a normal government school because there are no missionaries left. Some of them don't have boards of governors. And the entire mission ethos has been removed. In some of the major ones, it is still present. St. Francis Malacca, St. Michael's Ipoh are some examples where they're still quite well filled in with what a mission school is supposed to be. But in many cases, they are not. So that's the challenge of what are we supposed to preserve. Yeah, does that answer the question? Sorry, Dr. Goh, you're muted. You're muted.
I hope Dr. Kee have answered a Jean question. If it's not clear, Jean, please pose a new question. Now I move to the second question. The question from Liam Lo. He say, I have learned more about Malaysian heritage building more than I did online, and I thank you for this. Just wondering, are these heritage building well documented like how we did at Taylor University, where students work with teachers to document them in line works for future renovation and maintenance?
Okay, they are to some extent well documented because there are a few issues that we face in mission school studies. The IJ Convent Sisters and the LaSalle Brothers run archives. They have very strong archives, and those things are rather well done. They don't have full sets of working drawings though for all the buildings because some were destroyed during the Second World War. But unfortunately, almost all the major buildings were occupied by the Japanese in the Second World War. And in many cases, the Japanese destroyed elements, all right? And so some of them have lost their architectural drawings, but they have quite a lot of other stuff. I mean, there's publications like the ones I did, there's publications that were done by other people. I think architecturally, my publication might be one of the only ones, because many of the other publications are done about the ethos and identity of the schools, not so much the architecture. In terms of measured drawings, UTM has done some, Taylor's has done some. In terms of the history, it's mostly in the mission archives, some in the French archives in France, some in Singapore, a lot of it's in Malaysia. So National Archive Negara also a little bit. But I think the idea is that sometimes the story you get about the mission schools depends on who tells the story and who keeps the archive and who preserves something. Right? I give you an example. When I visited St. Joseph's Novitiate in Penang, I visited when they were renovating it, when they were curating it for preservation as part of Gurney Paragon. And I actually met the conservator. And a nice guy, we're chatting to him. When I mentioned the LaSalle brothers, he basically didn't know who they were. And he's the conservator of the building. And I thought, how can you not know who these people are? They're just down the road in St. Xavier's. You're going to visit them. But he didn't know who they were and was not actually interested, because he said, oh, my job is to conserve this building through materials. He didn't feel he needed to know the history, which I thought was very strange, because, you know, if you conserve something physically, that's fine. But how about the intangible? Who tells the story? I would say about 2/3 of the chapels, the school chapels in Malaysia, probably deconsecrated. 1/3 are probably active. For the deconsecrated ones, if you don't tell the story, who knows what these things are, right? You remove the decoration, remove the stained glass, So someone's got to tell the story. So it depends on who tells the story. It depends who is interested. It depends on what is celebrated, because the stories can change. I think architecture is such a good document of history, because unless you demolish a building, it's very hard to say, yeah, that thing didn't exist, right? So there's this movement in America now to, let's remove statues that we find inconvenient. Now, I'm not going to comment on that, because it's not my place to comment on that. But when you talk about, if I don't like your history, I'm going to remove it, where does that leave you, right? You can remove anything if you decide I don't like your history. So architecture is a very, very good marker of history, because the building proves that something happened. And people who are interested in heritage, I think that's where preservation of architecture is really helpful and really powerful. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, then we move to the third question from Ji as well. He said, Dr. Kee, do you think that if missionary schools are transformed into other functions such as museum and event center, etc., will be a good idea to preserve the building, as it will create source of budget to maintain the school without funding from government or NGO?
Okay, that's what they've done in Singapore. But in Singapore, they've sold the building. Yeah. So there are two ways to look at it. One way is to rent the building. So let's say if I'm the Mission Institute and I say, okay, I don't want to sell the building for whatever reason, I want to hold on to my building, I will rent it to someone. If that person who rents the building can preserve it and give me enough income so that it's all right, yeah, in a way it's fine. Right? Again, it depends on why the building exists. Because all the mission schools that are still run as schools are basically run by the government. Obviously, the original ethos of the Mission Institutes is not being transmitted anymore to the students in almost every case. Not every case, but almost every case. So then it's up to the Mission Institute to decide, am I still willing to commit my manpower, my limited manpower, and my emotions, my feelings into this mission, if I'm not getting the returns that I would have wanted? Or do I put my efforts into this place, this space, and get some form of return? And I don't mean monetary, I mean ideologically, heritage-wise, identity, whatever you want to call it, social well-being, contribution to society even. because the ethos of the Mission Institutes was to contribute to society, and they did it very well in the past. And they are prevented from doing that now. So to come back to the question, yes, it would help to preserve the building, definitely. Because commercial prices of buildings in city centers of that type and that size, all architects will know, are very, 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 very high, right? When Gurney Paragon was sold to, when the St. Joseph's Training Center was sold to Gurney Paragon, it was sold for 98 million ringgit. And that was in the newspaper, it's public knowledge, because it was bought by a public firm. But if they held it to today, according to most recent price per square meter thing, it could have gone for 400 million, right? So the value of the buildings is huge, right? Because of where they are. But the maintenance cost of a heritage building is similarly huge, right? All architects know that. It costs more to maintain an old building than to build a new building. And especially if you want to maintain it in a way that's holistic, in a way that's correct to its ethos, to its function, to its identity, to its materials, very expensive. And those are the challenges. Those are the challenges facing all these schools, that they're such great places, but how do we maintain them? Especially if the government doesn't donate money.
Okay, then we jump a question a little bit. We take a question from the president of St. John Alumni Association, Mr. Isham Isa. His question, he said, "Hi, Dr. Kee. Thanks for the wonderful work for this publication. Certainly will be an important reference for conservation of mission school buildings in Malaysia." He said, "My question, as a building age, how best do we conserve the building? Materials are scarce, paints, tiles, and the value and spirit of the building architecture." That is his question.
Okay, when I was in St. John's, almost every other year, every second year, they would do a fundraising campaign to maintain the building maintenance fund, they used to call it. The building would be, I think when I was in St. John's Secondary, in the 5 years I was there, from 1 to from 5, I think they repainted the building twice, if I remember right. So when there was an ethos where the students felt they were part of a special group, mission school alumni, there was the ability to collect funds. I don't know much about whether they still do that now in St. John's. Maybe the alumni president will know more. But when I was there, because you kind of were told that you were part of a special club, and so you were willing to contribute. And because the school was very well known at the time, people were willing to donate to St. John's. It was like a very well-known school, like VI, right? Whereas that's changed now. So how do you then donate money now? Or how do you get money now? I'm not sure. Because the key is actually funding. Okay? I think the method statement of how to maintain an old building is known by architects. It's known by conservators. There is a certain way of doing it, a certain way of plastering, a certain way of painting, a certain way of pointing brickwork, etc., a certain way of replacing stained glass, a certain way of galvanizing metals, right? All that can be done, but it's expensive. So the issue is who funds it? And the reason also is upon funding lies method statement, right? So when the government does fund renovation for mission schools, which it does sometimes, it normally specifies who is the contractor. And that person who is the contractor is normally a type of contractor that the government will always use. That type of contractor the government always uses normally has no connection and no interest and no history renovating mission schools, right? So, but when it's funded privately, when the mission school gets a donor, then they can choose whoever they like to fund it. But they have to find their own money. So that's again that dichotomy, that problem in terms of funding, in terms of who does what and how different it is. And so again, I think, people like tell me things like, non-architects will say things like, the skills for maintaining such a building or to build even this building, this kind of architecture has disappeared. But actually it's not true, There are a lot of skills. You can actually rebuild mission schools if you want to, right? Because those schools whose working drawings exist, let's say, for example, the St. Xavier's Penang that was bombed, or the St. Paul's in Suraman that was demolished. Now, in theory, if you wanted to rebuild a faithful replica, you could. The skills are there. It will just cost a lot of money. They've done that in Germany after the Second World War. They lost a lot of buildings. And in Russia, after during communism, they demolished some cathedrals. They've rebuilt them exactly as they were, so that if you're a tourist, you visit, you can't tell the difference between a 500-year-old building and one that was built last year. So the skill set to do that is there. It's just that, does anyone want to spend the money to do it, right? And that perhaps alludes back to one of the earlier questions when someone asked, preserving them as event spaces, etc. So imagine now, if you, someone extremely wealthy out there buys a mission school somewhere and says, sorry, I'm going to buy this school, and I'm going to donate 500 million ringgit to touch it up, you'll have a fantastic, amazing product at the end, right, which will be the talk of the town, because you spend 500 million ringgit and you've really done it up. It can be done, skills are there, but the money is not, at least not at the moment.
Okay, then we take this, another question from Matt Chong. Thanks for the insightful talk on the topic that is close to heart. You have approached this talk from a very scientific, stating the facts, points of view. I'm curious to know what your personal interest for the future of these buildings, as someone who is sentimentally invested in the subject matter.
Okay, I tell my students sometimes that the best way not to be disappointed is to approach something with the lowest possible expectations. And I think when I did my books, I approached the subject with very low expectations because I didn't want to get depressed. So I said, I'm going to approach these, assuming all of them are blighted and all of them are being run like government schools, and I'm going to assume that everything's changed. When I did the study, I found that not everything had changed. Many of them were very, very fascinating, well-preserved, and people committed to their conservation, preservation ethos. And I must also mention immediately that the vast majority of people were really committed, were all non-Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus. A lot of Muslim, Buddhists, and Hindus are very committed to the ethos of the mission schools, their identity, and what makes them special. I mean, Catholics as well, obviously, but a lot of non-Christians, very interested. And I think that was a good thing. I felt that was a good thing because the mission schools were never meant as places to convert people to Christianity. They were never meant that way. I remember I spoke to one of the last Irish brothers, Brother Felix, who used to be the head of LaSalle PJ before he passed away, and he said he had zero converts in almost every school he was ever headmaster in, and he was fine with that. He said, that's not our role, that's not our role. Our role is to give education. And to give a good holistic education, a humanistic education, which gives people good values. And I think, so in terms of how I approach it, I still, in order not to disappoint myself, I will still approach this topic with low expectations, but with hope, right? I think hope is always important, right? I think we should have hope, but I'm just hope, but with low expectations. I think, again, see, we are not alone, by the way, in having mission schools in Southeast Asia. There are mission schools in Burma, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand even, not many in Thailand, but there are some, Singapore and Indonesia. In Thailand, in Vietnam, in Burma, Malaysia, and Singapore, they are the same type, LaSalle and IJ, okay? Now the LaSalle schools in Burma are completely nationalized, all run by the government, confiscated. The LaSalle brothers do not own the title anymore. In Vietnam, the communist government also took all the schools. The buildings, some of them are missing because in Vietnam they had a very long war, so some of the buildings are missing. In Burma, due to a severe lack of funding, the buildings are in quite poor shape. Now in Malaysia and Singapore, the buildings are legally mostly still owned by the institutes, by the LaSalle brothers, by the IJ sisters, and so forth. But they are facing difficulties of direction going forward. What do you do? What do you do with the buildings? And I think so. Therein lies opportunity, I guess, right? So unlike if you say, oh, you're in a place where the government has legally taken ownership of the building, you have no choices. But when you still have ownership, you have a choice. So I think that's the interesting thing facing the mission schools.
Okay. Then we took another question from Kenny Wong. Are the school mentioned still connected in terms of funding, circulation to Malaysia or Singapore, mission retreat to Europe, etc.? What's continue today?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question. Sorry, maybe.
The question is,
Yeah.
are the school mentioned still connected in terms of funding circulation to Malaysia and Singapore? I believe it's for those mission school, mission retreat to Europe. So what continue today? Is that any other funding on
Okay,
coming?
I will respond to the question in the way I think, or what I think it means. But apologies if the questioner, if I don't answer what you are asking, just let me know. Maybe we can do it directly later or during this time. If the question is there funding from the Mother Institute in Europe? The answer is by and large, in the case of the IJ Sisters, the answer is no. And the reason is the institute has almost vanished in Europe. The funny thing about the IJ Sisters is that before they started in Malaysia and Singapore, they didn't exist outside France. None of them effectively spoke English. They were a very French-based institute. And they only started a training center in Ireland in order to send missionary sisters to Malaysia and Singapore. And before that, they were all French-speaking and they couldn't really speak English. And so their identity changed because of Malaysia and Singapore. And after Malaysia and Singapore became independent, and after when Ireland stopped producing so many missionaries, there's a social reason for that, by the way, because Ireland used to have lots of children. People used to have lots of children in Ireland, used to be very poor, used to be very normal, traditional too. You've got 7 daughters, 2 of them become nuns, very common. It's less common now. So now the largest concentration of IJ sisters left in the world is actually Malaysia. Right? There are very few left in Europe. And those left in Europe are in their 80s and so on. Those left in Malaysia are only in their 70s. There are some young ones as well. They still get more busy. But as a result, there's no more funding from Europe by and large. So they've got to raise their own funds and so on. Now, the LaSalle brothers, they're still a large group. They used to be the second largest religious institute in the world in the Catholic Church after the Jesuits, because they did peak at nearly 18,000 people. Now they're down to about 4,000 or slightly under. And again, those 4,000 or slightly under are mostly now coming from South America and parts of Asia. Vietnam is actually getting a lot of novices for the LaSalle brothers. Not that many coming from Europe. So a lot of their training institutes worldwide are closing down. So it's a social change in the Catholic Church. Those of you who are Catholic will know what I mean. And the idea of donning a missionary cloak and doing something is changed, shifted. So it's very rare now to find people doing this, which is, again, something quite romantic and exciting about the entire mission school question, right? Where this group of people have changed. The world has changed, and these buildings remain. So in terms of funding, basically, it's a complicated question, and I think funding is given by well-wishers, funding is given occasionally by the government, funding is given by alumni, etc., a variety of sources. There were people approaching St. John's to rent the field, to rent the field, to thematize the field and pay them money to have a football, temporary football stadium in the field to raise money. So there are different things, right? I don't know. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, then we take the next question from Lim Yang. The discussion is more about the history and from the perspective of political events and religion events, but didn't mention about the heritage. What is inherited from the past to the present, and what kind of memory we are going through? Doesn't seem they are from the view of local rather than from foreigner and government. And future, what is the identity of mission school now? In the present, what's shaping its identity from now and then?
Okay, I think that's a good question. And because it depends on the generation that you are when you go to these schools. Because, you go to school for, if you count primary school as well as secondary, 12 years maximum if you do from 6, or 10 years if you don't do from 6 and so on. Now, if you went to a mission school before 1955, regardless of your religion, you would have studied the Bible. It was mandatory. You could be Muslim, you still study the Bible. And it would be in English. everything. And if you went before the Second World War, you probably studied French as well. Okay? Now, after 1955, but before 1989, I'd say, you would not study the Bible anymore. But if you were Christian, you would. But if you're not, you wouldn't. It's not mandatory anymore. In fact, it's not possible. You were not allowed to teach the Bible to a non-Christian after 1950s. But it would, at least until the 1970s change, it would be still in English. After the 1970s change, it would be Malay. And after 1989 especially, it will be almost identical to a normal government school. So I think the idea of what is the heritage of the mission schools depends on which cohort of students went through the system, which cohort of local students. Yeah? They're all local students, by the way. All the mission schools, all students, 100% local. Right? They were not in any way meant for expatriates. They're all meant for locals. And as I said earlier, in every single school, the majority of the population was always non-Christian. So when you have that changing identity, that's why it's such a difficult topic to pin down. The identity is fluid. So that's why when I did my doctorate, I said the plural, multiple narratives, right? It's a plural heritage, there's more than one heritage. It can be interpreted differently depending on who interprets it. So the idea of what we preserve, again, as I said, it's very important to decide from what point of view do you require or do you want to do this preservation. Government's point of view is one matter. Alumni point of view is another matter. Religious institute point of view is another matter. Catholic Church point of view, which is the same as religious institute, but it's not exactly the same. Yeah, it's like saying one is the mothership, one is the small ship, right? It's also a slightly different matter. So it depends on how or what you want to preserve, which makes the mission school category within ICOMOS's heritage schools quite specific and quite unique because they have such a so-called separate and very fascinating identity, which means that if you preserve the physical without the intangible, it is very superficial. If you preserve the intangible without the physical, it cannot be understood, right? It's like telling a story without watching a movie or without having the text of a novel, just verbally. But if you can preserve the part of the intangible with part of the physical, then it becomes extremely valuable and interesting. And well, that's my opinion anyway.
Okay, let me take another question from an anonymous attendee. Question was, all the heritage school sites are with better spatial quality with large playing fields and gardens lawn in between. Why aren't the newer school design adopting the same kind of approach? That's a question. Okay,
the reason is basically, I'm not sure if anonymous is from Malaysia or not, but what happens is that if you look at most of the land plots in Malaysia, even housing, right? If you look back at rich people's housing back in the 19th century, there were 1 acre plots, right? This is like before the First World War. Between the First and Second World War, those became half acre. After the Second World War and until the 80s, that became quarter acre. And now you're probably talking about 1/6 of an acre, right? For what we call a bungalow, what in Europe they call a villa. Sizes have shrunk because land is getting more scarce, especially in the city center, because populations increase, pressures increase, etc. So it is very difficult to build a new school with huge lands anymore. However, if the person building the school is the government and that school is in the suburb, you do have modern government schools with very large grounds. You do. They're just not in the city center. The reason is in the city center, you only get old schools in the city center, right? For the same reason why most people, urbanites in Malaysia, we live in the suburbs, because in the city, they're all commercial buildings and old buildings, etc. So because of that, sizes in the city centers have dropped, because when people buy a large piece of land, they also subdivide the plot, right? It's like saying, oh, I bought 12 acres of land. Well, I'm going to subdivide it into 12 lots of 1 acre each. And on each 1 acre, I'm going to build my separate skyscraper, because it's not commercially viable to have such a large plot dedicated to one function like a school in the city center anymore. So it's a historical and a socio-economic reason.
Okay, then we take the next question from Raymond Cole. I believe during the time of building, many of these structures are in uncertain times. I'm a Johannyan, and yes, we do pride ourselves with version of supernatural stories. The older, the scarier. But we also do talk about hidden chambers and tunnels. It is part of architecture to look for such chamber or special rooms as part of its structure design and intent.
Okay, the reason why this charming story started, not just in St. John's but other places, is there was one genuine story, St. Michael's Institution in Ipoh, that after the Second World War, they did discover a rifle in the roof because during the war, the Japanese occupied the building, and it was all Japanese occupations were military. Okay, so there were always military soldiers stationed in all the schools, and they had kept munitions in the building. And after the war, at least one rifle was discovered. And in Convent Street, Penang, it was also used as a prisoner of war camp briefly, because there's this American submarine that got beached near Penang, and its sailors were kept as prisoners of war in the convent for a while. And they left graffiti, they carved their names into the walls. And that there's now a memorial plaque for these sailors, and the graffiti is protected graffiti behind a perspex plaque, right? So that's the reason why some of these mission schools have these charming stories. I mean, everyone likes a good story. Personally, as an architect, I only believe what I see. Personally, I've not seen any of these tunnels and so on. I mean, although I must confess to the questioner that I do have a strange memory from St. John's Primary School, where I have a very distinct memory of seeing someone with green eyes and black cat. I really have this distinct memory. But I just assume I had an active imagination as a child. That answers the question.
Okay, again, from this anonymous attendee, he say, hi, Doc. Is there any policy or blueprint for conservation guideline in action to control the originality of the current existing building, like in St. John? I saw the Lasalian statue turned into gold color instead of bronze color as it's supposed to be.
Short answer is no. There's no particular SOP, so to speak. SOPs for conservation appear especially in places like Penang and Malacca, where the local council has an SOP. To a lesser extent, they appear in places like Taiping, where they have self-branded as a heritage town, and parts of Ipoh. So SOPs to be, how's the word? If you want to enforce an SOP, it must be legally enforced by the government, either by some form of building regulation or some form of conservation regulation. Now, having said that, in the places like St. John's, there is, because you have Warisan Negara, right? So national heritage. Now, what does that mean? National heritage normally means you cannot extend, renovate, or materially change a building without, you cannot do those three things. If you are heritage class 2, normally you can renovate. You can even change the use. Okay, but national heritage means you can change very little. But having said that, if Anonymous was from St. John's, you will know that the chapel of the school has already been renovated. It's now a meeting room for the private school. So, but they've kept the stained glass, and they've tried to put in partitions which can be removed. Okay, temporary partitions. The brothers' quarters above have also been changed, where I think that one, the function is not yet clear-cut. But sometimes what happens when people renovate a building which has status as a heritage building, they put in things which are reversible. It's like saying, okay, I put in a wall here, but it's a dry wall, it's a softboard gypsum wall. So if I later on take it down, I can take it down, right? So so I would say there's no specific SOP for mission schools, definitely not. But there are local SOPs for heritage buildings which would apply for mission schools if they were listed as such.
Okay, well answered. Let me take another question from Sufian Alif. He say, hi, this is an interesting session by relevant expert. Do building owner or schools conduct an architecture day for members of public to take a guided tour? This can further increase public awareness of these buildings as containers of history and needs for conservation.
I am not sure is the answer to that question. I know that there are different heritage walks in different cities, and some of those heritage walks do encompass the mission schools. I know they have a heritage walk in Klang, which does bring people to the convent in Klang. The schools themselves, I am not sure if they do that. In a way, it would be a good idea if they want to raise funds, because the buildings are very interesting. Yeah, but unfortunately, I don't know the answer. I think people who are in the committees, the school committees, they will probably know that better than me.
Okay, we will try as the rep from Heritage School program. We will try to see how we can persuade all this building owner of this heritage school to actually start to look into the possibility of this heritage walk or architecture tour.
Sure.
Right. And let's take the next question. Do you think the quality of leadership has to do with the current state of our heritage school?
I think it's okay. Basically, I think I certainly don't want to blame anyone for anything. Right? I think that's not my place to do that. I think the current state of the heritage school, so to speak, is a result of many events, many of them outside the control of the Mission Institutes, many of them within the control of the government, but outside the control of certain other events which happen internationally, and also affected by socio-economic reality of Malaysia and the world. Okay, because I think since the 1960s, you've had a collapse of Catholic vocations worldwide for people entering priesthood, plus our brothers, our sisters. All these groups have shrunk in size, and that's a worldwide phenomenon. Within Malaysia, you've got pressures of the political discomfort with the idea of missionary education. You've also got the socio-economic pressures to do with very valuable sites within the city center. You've got changes to the language of instruction from English to Malay, which affected the strength of the mission schools, because their strength was to teach in English. And things like that. So I think it's a confluence of factors. But I wouldn't perhaps allude blame, because depending on your point of view, every single one of these players had a certain positive mindset approaching what they did, right? It's like saying, oh, I may disagree with you. You may have a different point of view from me, but you did it because of what you thought was right. And the other guy did it completely 180 degrees different from how I would do it, but he thought he was right as well. So a lot of people approach this topic with good intentions based on their point of view. But it's just that, as with any democracy, when you have multiple points of view, you have multiple disagreements. And that has certainly happened with the mission schools. Will probably continue to happen. So it's up to concerned people to decide, how do we move forward? How do we help these schools preserve, if we want to preserve them? How do we let them do something helpful to Malaysian society? How can they continue to contribute, etc., etc.? And I think that's an open question for everyone.
Okay, so let's take this question from Akitek Sarina Intan Abdullah. The question is, how much does the Parent-Teacher Association play a role in conserving this school?
Okay, a limited role, I would say, because it depends whether the school has a board of governors or not. If the school has a board of governors, they normally take the lead in preserving the building. The Parent Teachers Association is mainly concerned about the quality of education their kids get, right, to the school, which is fair, right? Which is fair. Because it's like saying, well, if my kid goes to such and such a school, my main concern is he needs to get a good education. If that good education comes from a school that looks like a shoebox or a school that looks like a palace, I just want him to get a good education, right? So I think, can the PTAs get more involved? Yeah, they could, if there was a reason for them to get more involved. Right? I think the issue is that it alludes to one of the previous questions about the students and their point of view. Right? If you spoke to a mission school student today, depending on which school he went to, that person, he or she, that person may have no idea that his or her school is any different from the Sekolah Kebangsaan down the road. Just looks a bit nicer. Oh, looks nice, cool. But it's all right. So it depends on what he's been fed, he or she, his cultural background, his openness to things. I think the other thing just to mention is that when I went to these schools, they were of course free. I mean, they're still free, you don't pay fees. Right? When St. Xavier's opened, they charge $1 a month, $1 a month. But there was this connection with Europe, right? So you had European brothers. I was taught catechism by a brother from the Czech Republic. There were brothers from Burma in St. John's at the time. Our former head was from Canada. So we had this European staff, right? But we didn't pay fees. Now, if you go to school with a European headmaster, you probably have to pay 30,000 a year, at least, maybe 50,000. Not sure. But at the time, Brother Felix, who I interviewed, head of LaSalle PJ from Ireland, and of course, people who went to LaSalle PJ didn't pay fees. So the idea of what the Mission Institutes did at the time, that internationalization of thought, because you had these people from worldwide who taught that, was quite a valuable thing in itself. You probably couldn't easily replicate that now because there's so few of them around. And the world has changed. But it means that the places as heritage are very important, but it just leaves a lot of challenges in terms of how to preserve and what to do.
Okay, let's take another question we only have 5 minutes left. I try to take as much as I can. This question from Kevin, he said, is that a reason why St. John received the highest level of heritage preservation and not the other mission school?
Okay, again, that is a question I think only the government can answer. But I suspect it's something to do with visibility because St. John's is located in Kuala Lumpur. So I think it's what we call a low-hanging fruit in terms of conservation. Right? I mean, I allude to numbers. Okay? In the UK, there are 2 million listed buildings, 2 million listed buildings of one type or another. Because there are several categories of protection, as what they call grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 1 star, whatever, there are 5, 6 categories. In Malaysia, I think we have, in terms of Warisan Negara, I believe it's 200 or something like that. But within the UNESCO zones, there are thousands, of course. Within Georgetown and Malacca, there are thousands. Within the zone, within the different small towns like Taipei and whatnot, they have their own conservation zones. So there are zone conservation, there are quite a number, but the full heritage national Warisan Negara, there are very few actually. And I think that's just a choice. I mean, I don't know why it was chosen compared to the others. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, most people think St. John's is a very beautiful design. Is it more beautiful than some of the others? It just depends on your point of view. So yeah. But I think it's something to do with visibility. Because I think when you establish something as national heritage, you're basically trying to say that A, you are doing something, and you are doing something that people can see and notice. So if something is very prominent and you can see and notice it, you say, oh, you preserve that building, it's very visible. Similarly, like the Anglican Cathedral in Georgetown, Penang is also National Heritage Warisan Negara. And that was renovated by the government, fully funded by the government. The only time I think they've fully funded a church renovation in West Malaysia. For heritage, right? And it's very visible. It's the center of Georgetown. So things like that happen, and maybe they choose the prominent ones. I'm not sure.
Okay. I will take few compliment from what I can see from Zoom webinar chat. First is from Saiful Shahidan. He said the movie title is The Garden of Evening Mist, based on a novel by Tan Kay Hin.
Yeah. The movie, yes.
Shortlisted for Man Booker Prize. No, Man Booker Prize.
Yeah, Booker Prize for
me. Yeah. And then is another compliment, I believe. This is not a question. However, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to your effort and this initiative from the old boy of SGI Typing 89.
Thank you.
And I will say I've taken all the question, and then there's one more question left, and by Ji Ying. That question I was answered previously. I'll say with that we have managed to answer all the questions raised, and I will say thank you, Dr. Kee, for the very impressive presentation. I will say, and from the presentation we can see how how deep the knowledge you have and the kind of passion you have with the research of this missionary school. And I must say that one of the reasons why we actually crafted this heritage school program is because we can see a value of the heritage. But somehow, because in a school building, who is going to manage? Because if the school is actually under the care of the education minister, education is more important than the building itself to some extent. So that's why we actually crafted this, and good enough, Jabatan Warisan Negara have St. John Institution as the highest name of this. Like you say, we do not know why this school, and I hope that this is not the only school. So more schools will come, and we really need your help and other experts in Malaysia who have done equally similar type of research, whether it's a missionary or non-missionary school, to actually contribute to the kind of I would say research, as well as the expansion of the idea of the protection and the widespread of this conservation and the preserving of the heritage, as well as the memory and the identity of the school. And I will believe maybe you may need to talk a little bit on this the missionary school, as well as the kind of how it actually help in terms of the education in Malaysia. That I will hope that maybe you can give a little bit, maybe like 1 or 2 minutes talk, because that is actually captured in your books, and the kind of insertion on the program or the syllabus in the Malaysia education system.
So, sorry, just to make sure I don't misunderstand you, are you asking me to comment on whether or not, when you say our education system, do you mean to talk about mission schools in terms of history, or to talk about how mission schools influence the education system?
Yes.
Which one? Sorry.
Mission school influence the Malaysian education system to some extent.
Oh, I see. Okay. Actually, the influence was very, very great originally, because during the time of multiple streams of language, right, where you had the English, Malay, Chinese, Tamil stream. Before, in the 1930s, more than half the English stream schools were mission schools. So they were very, very vital in terms of their influence. And many things to do with pedagogy, many things to do with certain types of expectations of, I would say, behavior and even uniform. Okay, the pinafore design, the traditional pinafore uniform of the national schools up to today was inspired by the convent uniform for girls, okay, which predated the National Education Act. So that idea of having that kind of uniform, quite modest, was a convent thing, right? And the idea of the way classes are conducted. See, the LaSalle brothers, although it's a very, very historical thing, they were the pioneers of doing what was called the simultaneous method of education, which basically means that you have a teacher in front of class. Now, it may sound banal because everyone does that, but before they did that in Europe, the idea was what they call the monitor system, where the master would tutor a monitor who would then repeat to the class. So the monitor did the so-called teaching. The master tutored the monitor. He would get the brightest students, like 5 in a class of 50, then those 5 would then help all the other students. So the LaSalle brothers pioneered the idea of simultaneous teaching, where the teacher would so-called remove the middleman and teach directly. But that was a much earlier thing that they did in Europe. And then when they did it in Malaysia, of course, they repeated their same system. Now, of course, that's the norm today, but basically the mission schools were instrumental in formalizing certain types of education pedagogy in Malaysia, which is now seen as the traditional way. Okay? It means that, I keep saying traditional because that itself may be changing as we go into blended learning, as we go into high technology, etc. That traditional way may change, probably will change. But at least until the end of the 20th century, that traditional way was the norm. And it was basically pioneered by the mission schools over here.
Okay. So with this, I would say I'd like to thank Dr. Kee to spare your times. I would like to thank all the attendees to spare your times to attend our first talk under this program. I will hope more talks will come. And I would like to have Dr. Kee to do the presentation in the future, as well as the talk when the program develop actually further. So with that, I would like to end today's session. Thank you so much.